The unjust incident. Marcus sat at his desk, nervously tapping his pen against the edge of his notebook. His heart raced as he waited for his turn to present his project in front of the class. As a bright student with a strong passion for history and social justice, he had put in countless hours researching his topic, the role of grassroots movements in shaping democracy. He knew the material inside and out, but that didn't stop the anxiety from creeping in. It wasn't the subject matter that made Marcus uneasy. No, it was the fact that Mr. Collins, his history teacher, had never made him feel truly comfortable in the classroom. Whether it was a slight change in tone when speaking to him, or the way Mr. Collins always seemed to dismiss Marcus's comments, he had learned to stay cautious around the teacher. Still, he wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. As his name was called, Marcus stood up, his palms slightly sweaty. He made his way to the front of the classroom, setting his presentation slides up. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the projector. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began. He started confidently, outlining the key points of his presentation, explaining how grassroots movements, often led by marginalized communities, had historically brought about significant social change. He talked about the civil rights movement, the role of women's suffrage activists, and how ordinary people could reshape the course of history through sheer determination and unity. But as he spoke, he noticed Mr. Collins' expression shift. At first, it was a casual disinterest, but soon it morphed into something more condescending. Marcus tried to focus on his slides, ignoring the growing discomfort gnawing at his confidence. Then it happened. As Marcus moved into the part of his presentation discussing the power of protest in modern times, Mr. Collins cut him off mid-sentence. Marcus, I think we've heard enough," he said, waving his hand dismissively. The class fell silent, the abrupt interruption hanging heavy in the air. Marcus froze. He hadn't even gotten to the heart of his argument yet. His voice faltered, "But I'm not done, Mr. Collins." Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, with an exaggerated sigh. "Yes, well, I think we get the gist. It's a nice idea and all, but you're clearly missing the bigger picture here. Grassroots movements might be idealistic, but let's be real, they don't truly change the world in any significant way." The words hit Marcus like a slap. His throat tightened, and he could feel the weight of all his classmates' eyes on him. He had worked so hard on this project, but Mr. Collins was brushing it off as if it were child's play. Some of the students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged amused glances. Marcus could hear a few muffled snickers from the back of the room. His vision blurred for a moment as he tried to blink away the sting of humiliation. I was trying to explain how. Marcus attempted to continue, but Mr. Collins cut him off again, his tone growing sharper. "You were trying, yes, but your argument lacks a certain depth. You see, Marcus, these movements you're praising, they don't operate in the real world like you think they do. You're idealizing everything, not understanding how power really works." Marcus clenched his fists by his side, feeling his face grow warm. He wanted to defend his points, to push back against the oversimplified dismissal of everything he believed in. But in that moment, he couldn't find the words. Mr. Collins had taken control of the narrative, and Marcus was left standing there, speechless. The class seemed to hang in limbo, watching the exchange unfold. Some of the students looked down at their desks, uncomfortable with what was happening. Others sat quietly, complicit in their silence, as if afraid that speaking up might draw attention to themselves. Marcus's best friend, Jamie, who was sitting near the front, gave him an encouraging look, her eyes filled with sympathy. But even that wasn't enough to shake the feeling of isolation that settled over him. Mr. Collins continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Next time, maybe stick to something more grounded. Leave the idealistic fantasies for the activists and focus on what's practical. You'll get further in life that way." Marcus wanted to scream. He wanted to shout that grassroots movements had changed the world, that without them, much of the progress they enjoyed today wouldn't exist. But the humiliation was too overwhelming. His voice caught in his throat, and all he could do was stand there, defeated. "All right, class," Mr. Collins said, turning his attention back to the rest of the students as though Marcus had never been standing there. "Let's move on to the next presentation. Who's up?" The transition was swift, brutal, and callous. Marcus quietly walked back to his seat, his legs feeling weak. His mind swirled with anger, hurt, and confusion. He didn't know how to process what had just happened. All he knew was that the pain of being so publicly belittled felt unbearable. The rest of the class seemed to drag on forever. Marcus barely heard the other presentations. All he could think about was how Mr. Collins had made him feel, small, powerless, and irrelevant. By the time the bell rang, Marcus gathered his things as quickly as possible, eager to escape the classroom. He didn't want to talk to anyone, not even Jamie. He just needed to get away, to find somewhere he could be alone and try to make sense of the emotions raging inside him. As he walked down the hallway, head lowered, the weight of the incident bore down on him. He had always known that the world could be unfair, that people like Mr. Collins existed, but knowing it didn't make it any easier to face. And in that moment, Marcus knew that this wasn't something he could just walk away from. Something had to change. Something within him had already started to shift. He wasn't going to let this humiliation define him. Not this time, the fallout. The school day dragged on in a haze for Marcus after the incident with Mr. Collins. The humiliation from the classroom clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake off, and the sting of it sat heavy in his chest. He spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact with his classmates, keeping his head down in an attempt to disappear. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't outrun the storm of emotions swirling inside him. As he walked through the hallways, he overheard whispers. Some students threw curious glances in his direction, their expressions unreadable. Others, especially the ones who found the whole thing amusing, snickered as he passed by. He caught snippets of conversations. "Did you see how Collins shut him down?" And each one felt like a fresh cut. By the time the final bell rang, Marcus felt completely drained. He hadn't expected to feel so powerless, and the sense of self-doubt creeping into his mind unsettled him deeply. Had he been wrong? Was his presentation really as naive and idealistic as Mr. Collins had said? He had been so confident in his research, but now every part of him questioned whether he had missed something fundamental. Outside of school, Marcus met up with Jamie, his closest friend. She had been there, watching the whole thing unfold, and now her face was tight with concern. "Marcus," she started softly, "you know that wasn't right. The way he treated you, it was completely unfair." Marcus shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Maybe I did mess up," he muttered, his voice laced with uncertainty. "Maybe I didn't see the bigger picture. I mean, he's the teacher. He knows more than I do, right?" Jamie frowned, grabbing his arm to stop him from walking. "No, Marcus, he was wrong. You put so much work into that presentation, and it showed. He just didn't want to hear it." She paused, searching his face. "Don't let him make you doubt yourself. You've got to know that." Marcus wanted to believe her, but the weight of Mr. Collins' words was hard to shake. "Yeah, maybe," he said, but the doubt remained heavy in his mind. Jamie gave him a long look, then sighed. "You're stronger than this," she said quietly. "Don't let him win." When Marcus finally made his way home that evening, he could feel the tension coiling in his chest. Home was supposed to be his sanctuary, but today even the warmth of his familiar surroundings couldn't ease the ache inside him. His mother, Yolanda, noticed immediately that something was off as soon as he walked through the door. "Marcus, baby, what's wrong?" she asked, concern etched in her voice. She was sitting at the kitchen table, going over bills, but she set them aside as soon as she saw her son's face. Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He didn't want to worry her, but at the same time, he didn't know how to keep it bottled up any longer. "It's nothing, Mom," he said weakly, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Yolanda's eyes softened, and she got up to stand in front of him. "I've known you your whole life, Marcus. Don't tell me it's nothing." She gently placed her hands on his shoulders, her gaze steady. "Talk to me." With that gentle nudge, the floodgates opened. Marcus told her everything. About the presentation, about Mr. Collins' humiliating remarks, about the laughter in the classroom, and about the doubt that had been eating at him ever since. As he spoke, his voice wavered, and for a moment, he felt like that little boy who used to come running to his mother when he scraped his knee. By the time he finished, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and vulnerability. He hadn't expected to feel this emotional, but letting it out made the weight on his chest feel a little lighter. Yolanda listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with each word. When Marcus finished, she pulled him into a tight hug. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You didn't deserve any of it." Marcus pressed his face into her shoulder, feeling the comfort of her embrace. "I don't know what to do, Mom. I feel like I can't win. Mr. Collins, he made me feel so small, like I didn't know anything." Yolanda pulled back slightly, holding his face in her hands. "Marcus, listen to me," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "You are smart, capable, and powerful beyond measure. What that man did was wrong, and had nothing to do with your worth. He saw your brilliance, and it scared him." Her words caught Marcus off guard. Scared him. But why? "Because, baby," Yolanda said, her voice steady, "there are people in this world who fear the strength and intelligence of black men like you. When they see you standing tall, speaking your truth, they'll try to cut you down because they're threatened by what you represent." Marcus blinked, absorbing her words. "So, what do I do?" "You rise above it," Yolanda said, her voice filled with unwavering conviction. "You don't let one small-minded person dictate how you see yourself. You stand tall, you hold your head up, and you keep moving forward. Don't ever let someone else's ignorance define your path." Marcus nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of strength begin to stir inside him. His mother had always been his rock, and her words were like a balm to the wounds Mr. Collins had inflicted. But what if it happens again? What if people just keep seeing me like that? "They might," Yolanda admitted, "but that's their problem, not yours. Your job is to keep being the best version of yourself. You're going to face challenges, Marcus, but you are strong enough to overcome every single one of them. Remember that." Marcus felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest, a mixture of gratitude, love, and determination. His mother's faith in him made him believe, if only for a moment, that maybe he could rise above this. Later that evening after dinner, Marcus's father, David, sat down with him to talk as well. Though David wasn't as vocal about his emotions as Yolanda, his quiet strength was a source of comfort for Marcus. His father didn't need to say much. Just being there was enough. "I heard what happened today," David said as they sat together on the porch. He glanced at Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "You're going to face people like that, son. People who think they can put you in a box because of how you look. But you've got to remember something." Marcus looked at him, waiting. "You don't have to fit into their box. You're more than what they think. And when you show them that, when you respond with grace and power, it's going to leave them speechless." Marcus nodded, his father's quiet strength bolstering his own. It was a lesson David had taught him time and time again, but today, after everything, it resonated more deeply than ever before. As Marcus lay in bed that night, he replayed the events of the day in his mind. The hurt was still there, but so was something else, a small ember of defiance, of resilience, that refused to be extinguished. Mr. Collins had humiliated him in front of his peers, but Marcus knew he couldn't let that define him. His mother's words echoed in his mind, "You rise above it." And deep down, Marcus knew she was right. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. The teacher's history. Mr. Collins sat in the dimly lit living room of his suburban home, a glass of scotch resting on the table beside him. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as he shifted in his chair. His mind, however, was anything but still. The incident with Marcus earlier that day lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. He told himself, as he always did, that he had done nothing wrong. He was just being honest, giving Marcus real-world feedback that the boy would need if he ever wanted to succeed. But beneath that well-worn justification, Mr. Collins couldn't fully ignore the uncomfortable truth he had spent years avoiding. His thoughts drifted back to his own childhood, growing up in a small, predominantly white town in the Midwest. His father, a hard-working man who took pride in his rigid views of the world, had often preached about keeping things in order. For Mr. Collins, that had meant following in his father's footsteps, believing in hierarchy, discipline, and the notion that success was earned only by those who played by the rules. And in his father's mind, those rules didn't include room for people who looked like Marcus. Though never explicitly stated, Mr. Collins had absorbed his father's views on race, privilege, and the natural order of things. People like Marcus were troublemakers, always looking for an excuse to blame others for their shortcomings. And people like him, well, they were the ones tasked with keeping society functioning, making sure things stayed the way they were supposed to. But Mr. Collins wasn't a bad man, at least not in his own eyes. He didn't think of himself as racist. After all, he had never used slurs, never openly discriminated, and even had colleagues and acquaintances of different races. In his mind, that meant he couldn't possibly be part of the problem. Still, the nagging thought persisted. He had seen the way Marcus looked at him during the presentation, hurt, confused, and desperate to be heard. And, for a brief moment, Mr. Collins wondered if he had overstepped. Maybe he had been too harsh. But no, he quickly pushed the thought away. I was just doing my job, he reassured himself. If Marcus can't handle criticism, that's on him. Yet, his defensiveness masked a deeper truth. Mr. Collins had never really been comfortable with students like Marcus. Despite his years of teaching, he had always found it difficult to connect with students who didn't fit the mold he was used to. Students who came from different cultural backgrounds, who questioned authority, or who brought perspectives that challenged the status quo, they made him uneasy. Over the years, Mr. Collins had developed a pattern of behavior that subtly reinforced the barriers between himself and those students. He would shut down their ideas, dismiss their contributions, and steer conversations back to what he considered important topics. To him, it wasn't overt racism, it was just maintaining control in the classroom. But in doing so, he had unintentionally created an environment where students like Marcus felt unseen and unheard. Institutional racism, a system at play. What Mr. Collins didn't fully understand, or perhaps didn't want to understand, was how deeply the school system itself had contributed to his mindset. The school where he taught, like many others across the country, operated under the guise of being inclusive and progressive, but in reality, it perpetuated many of the same inequalities that had plagued society for generations. Subtle forms of institutional racism were woven into the fabric of the school's policies and practices. For instance, the curriculum Mr. Collins taught focused almost exclusively on Western history and achievements, rarely highlighting the contributions of non-white cultures. When students like Marcus spoke up about the importance of other perspectives, their voices were often drowned out by the dominant narrative. Additionally, disciplinary practices at the school disproportionately targeted Black and Latino students, though this was rarely acknowledged. Students of color were more likely to be sent to detention for minor infractions, while their white peers received warnings or leniency. Mr. Collins had never questioned these disparities, viewing them as just part of the job. After all, some students just didn't follow the rules the way others did. The administration often took a hands-off approach to addressing these issues, preferring to sweep them under the rug rather than confront the uncomfortable truth. When students or parents brought up concerns about discrimination, they were met with the same rehearsed responses. We take these matters seriously. We strive for inclusivity, and we don't tolerate racism. But little, if anything, ever changed. Mr. Collins had always been able to justify his actions within this system. He believed he was preparing his students for the real world, a world where they would have to work twice as hard to succeed. But what he failed to recognize was how his own biases had been shaped and reinforced by the very system he operated within. The system allowed people like him to thrive while marginalizing students like Marcus, and it had been doing so long before Mr. Collins ever entered the classroom. Classroom dynamics, not an isolated experience. What happened to Marcus that day wasn't an isolated incident. Over the years, other minority students had experienced similar treatment in Mr. Collins' classroom. He had a reputation for being tough on certain students, those who, in his mind, didn't fit the mold of the ideal student. Black and Latino students, in particular, seemed to bear the brunt of his critiques, though it was never explicit enough for anyone to call him out directly. Take Jessica, a Latina student who had once tried to present a project on the contributions of indigenous peoples to American society. Mr. Collins had dismissed her presentation halfway through, telling her she was focusing too much on fringe topics that didn't align with the course objectives. Jessica had left the classroom in tears that day, but nothing was ever done about it. Her parents had complained, but the administration had reassured them that Mr. Collins was a respected educator who simply had high standards. Then there was Deshawn, a quiet black student who had excelled in math but struggled with history. He had once tried to speak up during a class discussion about the civil rights movement, sharing a personal story about his grandfather's experiences. Mr. Collins had listened patiently, then redirected the conversation back to the textbook, completely ignoring Deshawn's contribution. Deshawn had never spoken up in class again. These were just a few examples of the subtle yet pervasive ways in which Mr. Collins, and by extension the school, had allowed racial discrimination to flourish. None of it was overt enough to spark outrage, but it was there, quiet, insidious, and deeply harmful. Marcus's experience that day was the culmination of years of such behavior. He had walked into that classroom with the hope of sharing his ideas, only to be met with the same dismissiveness that other minority students had faced before him. And while Mr. Collins might not have realized it, his actions had reinforced the message that students like Marcus weren't as valuable or worthy of respect. The unseen struggles. As Mr. Collins sat alone in his living room, he thought back on his years as a teacher. He had always prided himself on being a tough but fair educator, someone who prepared his students for the challenges of the world. But now, as he mulled over the incident with Marcus, a small voice in the back of his mind asked him a question he had never been willing to face. Had he really been fair? The question unsettled him, but he quickly pushed it aside, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truth. After all, Marcus was just one student, one presentation, one moment in a long career. Yet, as Mr. Collins finished his drink and set the empty glass down, a lingering doubt remained. Maybe Marcus wasn't the problem. Maybe the real issue lay in the system that had shaped him, and the biases he had spent his whole life denying. In a turmoil, Marcus lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the incident in his head over and over again. Mr. Collins' words echoed in his mind, each one stinging more sharply with every repetition. He had tried to focus on the facts during his presentation, to show the importance of grassroots movements in shaping democracy, but Mr. Collins hadn't even let him finish. The way his teacher had belittled him in front of the entire class made Marcus question everything: his work, his intelligence, his worth. His body felt heavy, like a weight was pressing him into the mattress. He couldn't shake the feeling of shame that had settled in his chest, and yet, alongside that shame, there was something else: anger. He could feel it simmering beneath the surface, not explosive or wild, but steady and controlled, like a fire that refused to burn out. Marcus had been here before, experiencing small slights and insults that he'd learned to brush off, but this time felt different. As the silence of his room enveloped him, Marcus began to reflect on the countless microaggressions he had endured over the years, moments that had chipped away at his confidence without him fully realizing it. Little things, like the way teachers sometimes looked right through him when he raised his hand, or how people at school would say, "You're so well-spoken for someone like you." as if it was a surprise that he could articulate his thoughts. He remembered one incident in particular, back in middle school, when he had corrected a teacher who had mispronounced a historical figure's name. The teacher had laughed it off, saying, "I guess he must know everything, huh?" The rest of the class had giggled, and Marcus had shrunk back into his seat, feeling embarrassed for speaking up. He had been brushing these moments off for years, telling himself they weren't worth making a fuss over. But now, lying in the darkness of his room, it all began to catch up to him. Every slight, every dismissal, every condescending comment had piled up, and it made him wonder. Had he been letting people like Mr. Collins control the way he saw himself all this time? "Why didn't I say something earlier?" he asked himself. "Why did I let him talk to me like that?" His mind raced with thoughts of what he could have done differently. Maybe he should have stood his ground, defended his ideas right then and there. But in the moment, all he had felt was the overwhelming pressure of being on the spot, of being the target of a teacher's public criticism. And now, in hindsight, it seemed like a missed opportunity. But what would speaking up really have done? Marcus knew how it worked in that school. If he had challenged Mr. Collins in front of the class, it would have backfired. He'd be labeled disrespectful or disruptive. His concerns would have been dismissed as overreactions, just like they had been for other students before him. And then what? Detention. A note home. Being marked as a problem student for the rest of the year. Marcus rolled over, his frustration intensifying. Is it worth it? He thought. Should I even try to fight back? Or is it better to just let it go, like I always do? But a part of him resisted that idea. His mother's words rang in his ears. You rise above it. Yet how could he rise above something that felt so deeply unjust without saying anything? His silence, he realized, wasn't making him stronger. It was giving people like Mr. Collins permission to keep doing what they were doing. Every time he stayed quiet, every time he avoided confrontation, he was letting them win. Still, the fear of consequences kept nagging at him. What if speaking up made things worse? What if Mr. Collins retaliated, not openly, but in subtle ways, lowering his grades, calling him out in class for minor things, making him feel even smaller? And then there was the school administration. Would they even take him seriously if he reported the incident? Or would they just dismiss it like they had with so many other students? It felt like an impossible decision. Marcus knew deep down that he couldn't stay silent forever, but he also didn't know how to fight back without jeopardizing his future. It was a delicate balance, and one wrong move could tip the scales in the wrong direction. Community tensions, whispers and uncertainty. As Marcus wrestled with his inner turmoil, subtle tensions were beginning to brew within the school community. Word of what had happened in Mr. Collins' classroom started to spread, as it always did in a small school. Students whispered about the incident in the hallways between classes, passing along different versions of the story. Some downplayed it, saying Mr. Collins was just being his usual tough self, while others, especially those who had been in the room, knew it was something more than that. Some students, particularly those from minority backgrounds, were quietly outraged by what had happened. They had seen it before, how Mr. Collins treated students like Marcus, dismissing their contributions and belittling their ideas. Many of them had felt the same sting of condescension, though they had never spoken up about it. Seeing Marcus go through the same thing only deepened the resentment they had been carrying for years. However, not everyone saw it that way. A handful of students found the situation amusing, mocking Marcus behind his back. He's so sensitive, they'd say, shrugging off the humiliation as if it were no big deal. Others were indifferent, too caught up in their own lives to care about what was happening to someone else. And then there were those who were just confused, unsure of how to respond. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what to do about it. Jamie, of course, remained fiercely loyal to Marcus. She had been one of the first to defend him, but even she could feel the awkwardness that was beginning to creep into their social circles. Other friends, who hadn't been in the classroom when the incident happened, didn't seem to know what to say. Some of them brushed it off as a teacher thing, while others just pretended like it hadn't happened at all. But Jamie wasn't having it. She knew that Marcus was struggling, and she wasn't going to let him go through this alone. She had already been talking to a few other students about what they could do to support him, but the idea of taking any kind of public action made her nervous. She didn't want to make things worse for Marcus, and like him, she was unsure of how to proceed without causing more harm. The tension grew in subtle ways, like a low hum beneath the surface of the school. Some teachers had caught wind of the situation too, though most turned a blind eye. After all, Mr. Collins was a senior staff member, respected for his years of experience. Challenging him could disrupt the delicate balance of authority in the school, and most didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Yet the more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that something had to change. He couldn't keep living in the shadows of other people's expectations, constantly bending to avoid conflict. He had a voice, and he deserved to use it. But how? That question haunted him every night. He knew he wasn't the only one who had been hurt by people like Mr. Collins, and he wasn't the first student to feel the weight of institutional racism. But what could he do to make things better, not just for himself, but for others who might follow in his footsteps? As he lay awake, staring once again at the ceiling, Marcus felt the fire inside him grow stronger. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let Mr. Collins silence him. Not this time. A mentor appears. The days following the incident with Mr. Collins blurred together for Marcus. He felt like he was moving through the halls in a fog, unsure of his next steps, but unwilling to stay stagnant. The tension he had been carrying since that humiliating moment gnawed at him, making it harder to focus in class and draining the energy from his once lively interactions with his friends. He was quieter now, more withdrawn, his mind constantly occupied with the question of what to do next. That was when Miss Johnson stepped in. Miss Johnson was one of the newer teachers at the school, a social studies instructor who had gained a reputation for being firm but fair, compassionate yet no-nonsense. She was in her mid-30s, with a calm demeanor and a soft voice that carried an unexpected strength. Marcus had her for one class, and while they hadn't interacted much beyond the usual teacher-student exchanges, she had always treated him with respect and kindness, qualities that seemed in short supply from some of the other teachers. It was after a long and tiring Wednesday, as Marcus was heading to his locker at the end of the day, that Miss Johnson approached him. He hadn't seen her coming and was startled when she called his name. Marcus. Her voice was gentle but firm, her brow creased with concern. He turned to face her, already bracing himself for whatever awkward conversation might follow. He wasn't in the mood to explain himself or talk about what had happened, not to anyone, especially a teacher. But something about the look in Miss Johnson's eyes stopped him from brushing her off. "Yes, Miss Johnson," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. She smiled, though there was a heaviness to it. "I heard about what happened in Mr. Collins' class the other day," she said, her words careful, as though she didn't want to intrude too quickly. "I wanted to check in with you. How are you doing?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected anyone outside his immediate circle to reach out to him, much less a teacher. "I'm fine," he said quickly, his guard still up. "It's no big deal." Miss Johnson's eyes softened. "It's okay if you're not fine, Marcus. You don't have to pretend that what happened didn't affect you." Her words cut through the wall he had been trying to build around himself. For a moment, Marcus didn't know what to say. No other teacher had ever acknowledged his struggles like that, and certainly none had asked how he was feeling. Usually, it was all about his performance, his grades, or his behavior. But this was different. I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice small. "I'm just confused, I guess. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Miss Johnson nodded, understanding in her eyes. "What Mr. Collins did wasn't right," she said. "You had every right to feel hurt and frustrated. I've been there myself." Marcus looked at her, surprised. "You have?" Miss Johnson sighed softly. "Oh yes. I face my own share of unfair treatment, both as a student and even now as a teacher. It's not always easy, especially when it feels like the system is stacked against you. But one thing I've learned is that staying silent only lets the problem grow. Speaking up, even when it's hard, is how we start to change things." She paused, giving Marcus a moment to absorb her words. He had never thought of Miss Johnson as someone who had gone through what he was experiencing now. She always seemed so composed, like nothing could faze her. But hearing her talk about her own struggles made him feel less alone, like maybe there was a way to deal with all of this that didn't involve staying quiet. "I've been thinking about saying something," Marcus admitted, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "But I don't know what good it'll do. People like Mr. Collins, they don't change." Miss Johnson's expression grew thoughtful. "You're right that change doesn't happen overnight," she said, "and sometimes it can feel like no one's listening. But history has shown us that when enough people speak out, even the most deeply entrenched systems can be transformed." She leaned against the locker beside him, folding her arms across her chest. "Do you know about John Lewis?" she asked suddenly. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, he was a civil rights leader. He fought for voting rights and marched with Dr. King, right?" Miss Johnson smiled, impressed. "Exactly. But did you know that before he became one of the most influential leaders in the civil rights movement, John Lewis was just a young man, like you, facing injustice? He grew up in a time where people like him were told they weren't good enough, that they didn't deserve the same rights as others. But instead of letting that defeat him, he chose to fight back, not with violence, but with determination, courage, and truth." Marcus listened, his interest piqued. He knew some of the basics of the civil rights movement, but hearing about it now, in the context of his own struggles, made it feel more personal, more immediate. John Lewis talked about making good trouble. Miss Johnson continued, her eyes lighting up as she spoke. "It means standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it feels like you're all alone." He knew that the only way to change the world was to disrupt the status quo, to challenge people like Mr. Collins who think they can get away with treating others unfairly. Marcus felt a flicker of something inside him, hope maybe. He had never thought of himself as someone who could make a difference, someone who could cause good trouble. But hearing Miss Johnson talk about John Lewis, and knowing that people in the past had faced far worse and still fought back, made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could do the same. "But how do I do that?" Marcus asked, his voice still laced with uncertainty. "I mean, I'm just one person. What can I really do?" Miss Johnson smiled gently. "It starts with small steps," she said. "You don't have to change the world overnight. But you can start by speaking your truth, by refusing to let people like Mr. Collins silence you. And you're not alone in this. There are others, students, teachers, and even people outside this school who want to see things change. If you stand up, others will stand with you." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You don't have to carry this burden alone, Marcus. But you do have the power to make a difference. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Marcus looked down at the floor, the gears turning in his mind. He had never thought of himself as someone who could inspire change, but Miss Johnson's words were planting seeds of possibility in his heart. Maybe he didn't have to stay silent. Maybe there was a way to take what had happened and turn it into something meaningful, something that could help not just him, but others who had experienced the same kind of mistreatment. Miss Johnson stood up straight, preparing to leave. "Think about it," she said softly. "And if you ever want to talk, my door is always open." As she walked away, Marcus felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. He still didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but for the first time since the incident, he didn't feel powerless. He thought of John Lewis and the idea of good trouble. Maybe he wasn't alone in this after all. Maybe this was his moment to take a stand, to show Mr. Collins and the world that his voice mattered. And in that moment, Marcus knew one thing for sure: he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The school's response. The next morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, feeling the weight of his decision to report the incident to the school administration. After his conversation with Miss Johnson, he had spent the evening thinking about what it would mean to take a stand. It wasn't just about Mr. Collins. It was about the way students like him had been treated for years. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that something needed to change. But as he prepared to walk into the principal's office later that day, a knot of anxiety formed in his stomach. What if they didn't listen? What if they told him it wasn't a big deal, just like others had done in the past? He tried to shake off the doubts as he entered the school building, but they clung to him, stubborn and unrelenting. By lunchtime, Marcus found himself outside the principal's office, his heart racing. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, Principal Harrison's secretary waved him in. Mr. Harrison was seated behind his desk, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he shuffled through paperwork. He was a tall man in his 50s, with thinning hair and a neatly pressed suit that made him look more like a businessman than an educator. "Marcus," Principal Harrison greeted him with a perfunctory smile. "What can I do for you today?" Marcus swallowed, feeling his palms grow clammy. I wanted to talk about something that happened in Mr. Collins' class a few days ago," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. The principal leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "Go ahead." Marcus recounted the incident, explaining how Mr. Collins had belittled him in front of the entire class, cutting him off and dismissing his ideas. He tried to keep his explanation clear and factual, but as he spoke, the hurt and frustration crept into his voice. He talked about how he had felt humiliated and how he believed Mr. Collins' actions were part of a larger pattern of behavior. When he finished, there was a long pause. Principal Harrison folded his hands on the desk, his face unreadable. For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the principal would understand. Maybe he'd take this seriously. But then Mr. Harrison spoke, and Marcus felt that flicker of hope snuffed out almost immediately. "I see," the principal said slowly, his tone measured. "I understand you're upset, Marcus, but I think there might have been a bit of a misunderstanding here." Marcus blinked, his heart sinking. "A misunderstanding?" "Yes," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice calm and professional. "Mr. Collins has a reputation for being tough on students, but he's an experienced educator. I'm sure he wasn't trying to single you out or humiliate you. It's possible that you misinterpreted his intentions." Marcus felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. "Misinterpreted? He cut me off in front of the whole class and said my ideas didn't matter." The principal raised a hand as if to placate him. "I understand that it might have felt personal, but Mr. Collins holds all of his students to a high standard. He challenges everyone. I don't believe this was about race or trying to humiliate you. Sometimes, teachers need to be firm to help students grow." Marcus's chest tightened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was like Principal Harrison was completely ignoring everything he had just said. "But it's not just about being firm," Marcus argued, his voice rising with frustration. "This happens to students like me all the time. We get dismissed, talked down to, and treated like we don't matter. It's not just one incident, it's a pattern." Principal Harrison gave him a sympathetic look, the kind of look people give when they don't believe you but don't want to say it outright. "I hear you, Marcus, but I think we need to be careful not to read too much into this. Mr. Collins is a valued member of our faculty, and I trust his judgment in the classroom. If you felt uncomfortable, I'm sorry for that, but I don't think there's a need for further action." Marcus felt like he had been punched in the gut. He had come in hoping that the administration would listen, that they would see what was happening and take it seriously. But instead, they were brushing it off, telling him that it was all in his head, that he was overreacting. "Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?" Principal Harrison asked, clearly ready to move on. Marcus stood up, the frustration boiling inside him. "No," he said quietly, his voice strained. "That's it." He left the office feeling more defeated than ever. He had taken the risk to speak up, to try and make a change, and all he had gotten in return was dismissal. It was like no one cared, like no one was willing to see what was right in front of them. He had always known that the system was flawed, but experiencing it firsthand, seeing how easily his concerns were brushed aside, made him feel helpless. Institutional blindness. A familiar story. As Marcus walked down the hall, his mind raced with anger and frustration. It wasn't just Mr. Collins who was the problem, it was the whole system. Principal Harrison's response had made that abundantly clear. They were more concerned with protecting their teachers and maintaining the status quo than with addressing the real issues that students like him faced. Marcus knew he wasn't the only one who had experienced this kind of treatment. He had heard stories from other students, Jessica, Deshawn, and others, about how they had tried to speak up, only to be told they were misinterpreting the situation. It was the same script every time: dismiss, deflect, and deny. By the time he got to Ms. Johnson's classroom, he felt like a balloon stretched to its limit, ready to burst at any moment. He knocked on the door, and Ms. Johnson, who had been sitting at her desk grading papers, looked up with a warm smile. But as soon as she saw the look on his face, her smile faded. "Marcus," she said softly, standing up and walking toward him. "What happened?" Marcus shook his head, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. "I talked to Principal Harrison," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "And he didn't take it seriously. He said I was misinterpreting things, that I shouldn't make it about race, that Mr. Collins is just a tough teacher. He didn't care, Ms. Johnson. No one cares." Ms. Johnson sighed, her expression pained but not surprised. She guided Marcus to a chair and sat down next to him. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I know how hard it is to feel like you're not being heard." "It's not fair," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "How am I supposed to make things better if they won't even listen to me? What's the point?" Miss Johnson was silent for a moment, as if carefully considering her words. "It's hard," she finally said, her voice gentle but firm. "But change doesn't happen overnight. The system you're up against has been in place for a long time, and it's resistant to change. But that doesn't mean you should give up. Change takes time, and sometimes it feels like every step forward comes with 2 steps back. But the fact that you spoke up, that you didn't stay silent, that's a victory in itself." Marcus looked at her, unsure how to respond. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like he had hit a wall. "I know it doesn't feel like it now," Miss Johnson continued, "but you're planting seeds, Marcus. You're showing people that you won't stand for this kind of treatment, and even if the administration isn't ready to acknowledge it yet, others are watching. The students who see what you're doing, the ones who've been through similar things, they're paying attention, and that matters." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He wanted to believe her, but it was hard to shake the sense of helplessness that had settled in his gut. "You're stronger than you know," Miss Johnson said, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "Don't let one setback stop you. Keep pushing, keep speaking up, and I'll be right here with you every step of the way." For the first time since leaving Principal Harrison's office, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. He wasn't done yet. And neither was the fight. Rallying allies. The days following Marcus's conversation with Miss Johnson were a blur of frustration and determination. The administration might have dismissed his concerns, but Marcus wasn't ready to back down. As Miss Johnson had said, change didn't come overnight, and the fight wasn't over yet. Word about what happened between Marcus and Mr. Collins continued to spread throughout the school. At first, the whispers in the hallways were quiet, almost imperceptible, but as more students learned the details of the incident, something began to shift. Marcus wasn't alone in his experience. Many students, especially those from minority backgrounds, had similar stories about being dismissed, belittled, or overlooked in the classroom. And they were tired of it. It started with Jamie. She had always been Marcus's biggest supporter, and she wasn't going to let him fight this battle alone. After hearing about the principal's response, she made it her mission to help Marcus figure out a way to push back. Jamie was outspoken and fiercely loyal, and she wasn't afraid to make her voice heard. One afternoon, as they sat together in the cafeteria, Jamie leaned in and said, "We need to do something, Marcus. This can't just be a Marcus thing. There are too many other students who've gone through this. We need to get them involved. Marcus looked at her, unsure. What do you mean? Jamie's eyes were bright with conviction. A protest, she said simply. A student-led protest. We get everyone together, everyone who's been treated unfairly or who's seen it happen, and we make the administration listen. Marcus felt a surge of excitement mixed with anxiety. The idea of a protest was bold, but it also felt risky. He knew that organizing something like that could have consequences, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Do you think people would actually join us? Jamie grinned. I know they will, and we're not doing it alone. I've already talked to Layla, and she's all in. Layla was another student at the school who had never been afraid to speak her mind. She had a reputation for being outspoken on social justice issues, and she had already organized a few small events to raise awareness about inequality. If anyone could help turn this into something real, it was her. Later that day, Marcus, Jamie, and Layla met in the school library to talk things through. Layla, as always, was direct and to the point. We need to be smart about this, she said, her voice low but determined. If we're going to do a protest, we need to make sure it's organized and peaceful. The administration will be looking for any excuse to shut it down, so we can't give them one. Jamie nodded in agreement. We'll start by talking to other students, people who've been affected by teachers like Mr. Collins, and even those who just care about what's right. We need to show that this isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern, and it's about making sure it doesn't keep happening. Marcus listened as they'd brainstormed ideas, feeling a sense of gratitude for the first time in days. He hadn't expected anyone to rally around him like this, but now that they were, it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe his protest was the way to make people see what was really happening. Student activism. A movement begins. Over the next few days, Jamie, Layla, and Marcus quietly reached out to other students, explaining their plan and asking for their support. At first, some students were hesitant, protesting against the administration, and especially against a teacher as well established as Mr. Collins, felt risky. But as word spread about the true nature of the protest, more students started to get on board. Deshawn, who had once been dismissed by Mr. Collins during a class discussion, was one of the first to join. I've been waiting for something like this, he told Marcus. It's about time someone stood up to these teachers who think they can treat us however they want. Jessica, who had been shut down when she tried to present on Indigenous contributions to American society, was next. She told Marcus, I thought it was just me. I didn't know other people were going through the same thing. Before long, a small but dedicated group of students had formed. They met after school in secret, planning out the details of the protest and figuring out how to get as many people involved as possible. Layla took the lead on organizing, drawing up plans for the protest, making sure it was peaceful, and preparing posters and flyers that would spread the word. They decided on a date, a Friday afternoon, right before the end of the school day. The plan was for students to walk out of class during the last period and gather in the courtyard, where they would hold a peaceful demonstration. There would be speeches from students like Marcus, Jessica, and Deshawn, and they would present a list of demands to the administration, calling for changes in how the school handled incidents of bias and discrimination. Conflict builds. A divided school. As the protest plan spread, however, it wasn't long before division started to creep into the student body. Some students were fully on board, ready to stand up for what was right, but others were more hesitant, and the reasons for their hesitation varied. Some students were afraid of retribution from teachers and administrators. What if they give us detention? One student asked. Or suspend us? I can't afford to get in trouble. I need my grades. Others didn't see the point. It's not like a protest is going to change anything, one student said dismissively. Mr. Collins has been here forever. He's not going anywhere. There were even some students who outright opposed the idea, siding with the administration. Mr. Collins is a good teacher, one of them argued. He's just tough. You guys are blowing this way out of proportion. Marcus heard the whispers as he walked through the halls, and it was hard not to let the doubt creep in. He knew the protest was the right thing to do, but the backlash made him nervous. What if the protest failed? What if it just made things worse? The day before the protest, Marcus sat in Miss Johnson's classroom after school, his nerves fraying. What if they don't listen, he asked her. What if we go through with this and nothing changes? Miss Johnson gave him a reassuring smile. Marcus, I won't lie to you. There's always a chance that things won't change right away. But that doesn't mean your efforts are for nothing. Every movement for change starts small, and sometimes the first step is just making people aware of the problem. What you're doing is important, whether or not the administration acknowledges it immediately. Marcus nodded, feeling a little steadier. Miss Johnson's faith in him meant more than he could express. She had been there every step of the way, encouraging him to keep fighting, and her words helped quiet some of his doubts. As he left her classroom that day, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. The protest might not change everything overnight, but it was a start, and sometimes starting was the hardest part. The next day, as the final bell rang and students began to walk out of their classrooms, Marcus stood in the courtyard, surrounded by a growing crowd of his peers. The tension was palpable, but so was the energy. This was it, the moment they had been building toward. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was about to happen, and then, with Jamie and Layla by his side, he stepped up to the front of the crowd, ready to make his voice heard. The protest had begun, the confrontation. The day of the protest had been a whirlwind. Students filled the courtyard, holding signs that read "Equality in the classroom" and "Stop dismissing our voices." Marcus had given his speech, sharing his story and calling for change. The energy was electric, but underneath it all, Marcus knew there was one more thing he had to do: confront Mr. Collins directly. He hadn't planned on it at first. The protest was meant to be a collective voice, a call for institutional change. But as the crowd began to disperse and students headed home, Marcus knew he couldn't walk away without speaking to the man who had ignited this movement. With his heart pounding in his chest, Marcus made his way to Mr. Collins' classroom. The hallways were quiet now, the echoes of the protest fading behind him. He reached the door, hesitating for only a second before pushing it open. Mr. Collins was sitting at his desk, packing up papers, unaware of Marcus standing in the doorway. For a brief moment, Marcus considered turning around, walking away without saying a word. But the thought of letting this opportunity slip through his fingers was unbearable. He had worked too hard to stay silent now. "Mr. Collins," Marcus called out, his voice firm but calm. The teacher looked up, startled to see Marcus standing there. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't immediately respond. "I need to talk to you," Marcus continued, stepping further into the room. Mr. Collins sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Marcus, if this is about the protest, I'm not interested. I've got a lot of work to do." "It's not just about the protest," Marcus said, refusing to be brushed off. "It's about what happened in class. I'm not here to argue, but I need you to understand what you did." Mr. Collins sighed, his expression weary. "Marcus, I already told you that you're making this a bigger deal than it is. I wasn't singling you out. I challenge all of my students." Marcus felt the familiar sting of frustration, but he forced himself to stay calm. He remembered what Ms. Johnson had told him: "Stay composed, stay focused." "You didn't just challenge me," Marcus said. "You dismissed me. You didn't let me finish, and you belittled my work in front of the entire class. That's not challenging someone, that's silencing them." Mr. Collins leaned forward, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "You're being too sensitive, Marcus. You can't expect me to coddle you just because you didn't like the feedback. This is the real world, and if you can't handle a little criticism, then you're in for a rude awakening." Marcus could feel the heat rising inside him, but he refused to let Mr. Collins get under his skin. "It wasn't just criticism," he said evenly. "You dismissed me because of who I am, not because of the quality of my work. You've done it before, And you've done it to other students too. Mr. Collins shook his head, a look of disbelief crossing his face. That's ridiculous. I treat all my students the same. No, you don't, Marcus countered, his voice steady. You dismiss students like me, the ones who don't look like you, the ones who bring perspectives you don't want to hear. And that's why we had the protest today, because it's not just about me, it's about all of us who've been silenced. Mr. Collins opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up his hand, stopping him. I know you don't want to admit it, Marcus continued, but this isn't about being tough on students. It's about your bias, whether you see it or not. You think you're challenging us, but what you're really doing is keeping us down, and I'm not going to stay silent about it anymore. For a moment, Mr. Collins looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected Marcus to speak with such clarity and conviction. His usual confidence faltered, and Marcus could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to come up with a response. But instead of engaging with Marcus's point, Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms once again. Look, Marcus, he said, his voice laced with condescension. I've been teaching for a long time. I've seen students come and go, and I know what works and what doesn't. You're still young, and you don't understand how the world really works yet. You're making this personal when it's not. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He thought about Ms. Johnson, about the figures in history she had introduced him to, John Lewis, Malcolm X, and others who had faced far greater obstacles than this and had risen above it. He wasn't going to let Mr. Collins deflect or deny what had happened. Not this time. You're right, Mr. Collins, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. I am young, and I may not understand everything about the world yet, but I do understand this. When someone tells you they've been hurt by your actions, you don't get to decide that they're wrong. You don't get to tell me that my feelings don't matter just because you've been teaching for a long time. Mr. Collins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Marcus pressed on. You say this isn't personal, but it is. You made it personal when you dismissed me in front of the entire class, when you treated me like my ideas weren't worth hearing. And I'm not the only one you've done this to. You've done it to other students, and it's time for it to stop. For a moment, there was silence. Mr. Collins opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He seemed genuinely unsettled by Marcus's composure, by the fact that he hadn't lashed out or backed down. Instead, Marcus had confronted him with an unwavering calm that Mr. Collins wasn't prepared for. I'm not asking for an apology, Marcus said, his voice quiet but powerful. I'm just asking you to think about what you're doing, to understand that your words have an impact, and that impact doesn't disappear just because you don't want to see it. Mr. Collins stared at Marcus, his face tight with discomfort. He had always been the one in control, the authority figure who set the tone in the classroom. But now, faced with a student who wasn't intimidated by him, who had the courage to speak truth to power, Mr. Collins was left speechless. I said what I needed to say, Marcus concluded, his eyes steady on Mr. Collins. The rest is up to you. Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned and walked out of the room, his heart racing but his mind clear. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had done it. He had confronted Mr. Collins, not with anger or resentment, but with strength and conviction. And no matter how Mr. Collins chose to respond, Marcus knew that he had taken a stand. He wasn't powerless anymore. He had found his voice, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The protest. The day of the protest arrived, and the atmosphere around the school was electric. There had been whispers all week, students talking in hushed tones, teachers giving knowing glances, and the administration trying to keep a tight lid on the situation. But no matter how much the school tried to keep things under control, the buzz of anticipation was undeniable. The protest was happening, and there was no stopping it now. By lunchtime, the signs were ready, the chants had been rehearsed, and the group of students who had quietly organized the event were in place. Marcus stood among them, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched more students gather in the courtyard. The signs they held up were bold and clear. Equality in the classroom, Our voices matter. Stop the silence, and respect for all students. The protest had started small, just a few close friends and supporters, but as the day went on, more and more students began to join. It wasn't long before the courtyard was filled with students from all walks of life, holding their signs high and chanting for change. There was a nervous energy in the air, but there was also a palpable sense of solidarity. This was more than just a protest for Marcus. It was a protest for everyone who had ever felt silenced, dismissed, or disrespected. Layla, one of the protest's key organizers, was leading the chants, her voice clear and strong as she called out, "What do we want?" Equality. The crowd responded in unison. When do we want it? Now. The chants echoed across the campus, growing louder with each passing minute. Some teachers watched from the windows, looking concerned or unsure of what to do. A few administrators hovered nearby, clearly anxious about how things were unfolding, but they hadn't intervened yet. As Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, taking it all in, Jamie appeared beside him. "It's time," she said quietly, giving him a reassuring nod. Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He had known this was coming, but now that it was here, the nerves were hitting him full force. He was supposed to speak, supposed to share his story in front of all these people, to demand change from a system that had ignored students like him for too long. But as he looked around at the faces of his classmates, people who had shown up to stand with him, people who were tired of being silent, he felt a surge of courage. He wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for all of them. With Jamie's steady hand on his shoulder, Marcus stepped forward, making his way to the front of the crowd. Layla quieted the chants, and all eyes turned to him. The courtyard fell into a tense silence, the only sound the distant hum of cars passing by on the street. Marcus took a deep breath, gripping the microphone tightly in his hand. His heart was still pounding, but he forced himself to steady his voice as he began to speak. "I didn't think I'd be standing here today," he started, his voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as he continued. "But I'm here because something happened in this school that shouldn't have happened. I'm here because, like so many of you, I've experienced what it feels like to be dismissed, to be talked down to, and to be silenced. And I'm here because we can't let that keep happening." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "A few weeks ago, I stood in front of my class, ready to present an idea I had worked hard on. I was proud of the work I'd done, and I thought my voice mattered. But instead of being heard, I was shut down. I was told that my ideas weren't important, that they were too idealistic, and I was dismissed in front of my peers. And the worst part, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, not to me, and not to many of you." Marcus's voice grew stronger, more confident as he spoke. The fear that had gripped him earlier was starting to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of purpose. For too long, students like us, students who don't fit the mold, who bring different perspectives, have been ignored, disrespected, and pushed aside. It's not just about one teacher or one classroom. It's about a culture in this school that tells us that our voices don't matter. He glanced at Jamie and Layla, who were both standing nearby, their eyes full of pride and encouragement. "But we're here today to say that our voices do matter, that we won't be silenced anymore. We're here to demand respect, equality, and justice for every student in this school." The crowd began to cheer, the energy in the courtyard rising with every word Marcus spoke. "We're not asking for special treatment," Marcus continued, his voice rising above the noise. "We're asking for the same respect that everyone deserves. We're asking for teachers to listen to us, to value our contributions, and to treat us like we belong in this school just as much as anyone else. And we're asking the administration to take action, to make real changes that ensure this doesn't keep happening." As Marcus finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause and cheers. The tension that had been building in his chest for weeks finally eased, and he felt a sense of release, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had done it, he had spoken his truth, and now there was no going back. The community's reaction, beyond the school walls. As the protest continued, word of what was happening began to spread beyond the school. A local reporter had caught wind of the event and showed up to cover the story. They interviewed a few students, including Marcus, and took photos of the crowd holding their signs, the energy of the protest clear in every shot. By the end of the day, the story had made its way onto local news websites, social media feeds, and even the evening news. Headlines like "Students Demand Equality in Local High School" and "Student-Led Protest Shines Light on Racial Bias in Education" started circulating, drawing attention from parents, community leaders, and even school board members. The school administration, which had been caught off guard by the protest momentum, was now faced with pressure not just from students, but from the broader community as well. Parents began calling the school, demanding to know why their children were protesting and what the administration was doing about the concerns being raised. The school board scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss the situation, and the principal, Mr. Harrison, found himself in a position he hadn't expected, having to answer to a community that was suddenly very invested in what was happening inside the school's walls. For Marcus, seeing the protest gain traction outside of the school was surreal. He had never imagined that his story, and the stories of so many other students, would reach such a wide audience. But more than that, he realized that they had started something. The protest had sparked a conversation, and now that conversation was spreading, creating the possibility for real change. That evening, Marcus sat with his family, watching the local news cover the protest. His mother, Yolanda, beamed with pride as the reporter talked about the student-led movement, highlighting Marcus's role in leading the charge. His father, David, gave him a quiet nod of approval, the kind that said more than words ever could. As the segment ended, Marcus's phone buzzed with messages of support from classmates, from people in the community, even from students he didn't know, thanking him for standing up and inspiring them to do the same. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, and change wouldn't come overnight. But for now, he had taken the first step, and that was enough. The protest wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about all of them, the students who had been silenced, the teachers who cared, and the community that was starting to pay attention. And Marcus knew, deep down, that they were just getting started. The turning point. Weeks passed after the protest, and though the tension in the school continued to build, it seemed like nothing was changing. Marcus still felt the weight of the backlash, both from students and teachers, and Mr. Collins's subtle retaliation showed no signs of stopping. But Marcus, with the support of Jamie, Layla, and Ms. Johnson, kept pushing forward. The fire that had been lit by the protest refused to burn out, even as doubt and frustration threatened to extinguish it. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. Marcus was sitting in the library, trying to focus on an essay for his English class, when his phone buzzed with a message from Jamie. "Check the news. It's happening." Confused, Marcus quickly opened a news site on his phone, and there it was, a headline about the school, front and center. School district investigates allegations of bias after student protest gains attention. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he read the article. It was about the protest, how the students had taken a stand against what they described as a pattern of racial bias and discrimination within the school. But more importantly, it mentioned that the school district had launched an official investigation into the allegations, spurred on by the media coverage and growing pressure from the community. The article went on to detail some of the concerns raised by students, including Marcus's experience with Mr. Collins. It also noted that several parents had filed complaints after hearing about similar incidents involving their own children, and the district was now conducting interviews with students, teachers, and administrators as part of the investigation. For the first time since the protest, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The district was finally paying attention. A breakthrough moment, the investigation. In the following days, district officials arrived at the school to conduct their investigation. They interviewed students who had participated in the protest, as well as those who had experienced similar treatment from teachers. Marcus, Jamie, Layla, and Deshawn were all called in for interviews, where they were asked to share their experiences in detail. Marcus spoke about the incident with Mr. Collins, but he also made sure to highlight the broader issues within the school, the patterns of dismissiveness and bias that had been allowed to fester for too long. It wasn't just the students who were interviewed. Miss Johnson, along with a few other teachers who had supported the students, also gave their accounts. Ms. Johnson was particularly vocal about the need for systemic change, pointing out that while Mr. Collins' actions were egregious, they were part of a larger culture that had been allowed to thrive in the school. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the protest had brought to light something much bigger than a single incident. The district officials uncovered multiple cases of students being dismissed or treated unfairly by teachers, cases that had never been addressed by the administration. These revelations put pressure on the school leadership to respond, and the investigation quickly gained momentum. Consequences for Mr. Collins. A few weeks into the investigation, word began to spread that Mr. Collins had been placed on administrative leave. The news sent shockwaves through the school. Marcus had suspected that something like this might happen, but seeing it unfold in real time was surreal. The district's investigation had revealed that Marcus's experience with Mr. Collins was not an isolated incident. Several students, some from years past, had come forward with similar stories of being belittled, dismissed, or targeted by Mr. Collins in the classroom. Some had never spoken up out of fear of retaliation, while others had reported the incidents but had been ignored by the administration. The district's review also uncovered patterns of bias in Mr. Collins's grading practices, particularly towards students of color and those who challenged his authority. In some cases, he had given lower grades without proper justification, while in others, he had refused to engage with students' ideas simply because they didn't align with his own worldview. With the evidence mounting, the district had no choice but to take action. Mr. Collins was officially reprimanded and faced disciplinary measures, including mandatory training on cultural competency and bias. While some parents and teachers rallied to defend him, claiming that he was a tough teacher who pushed his students to succeed, the overwhelming evidence against him made it impossible for the district to ignore the damage he had caused. For Marcus, hearing that Mr. Collins would face consequences was a moment of validation. After all the weeks of feeling dismissed and retaliated against, knowing that Mr. Collins' behavior had been exposed felt like a small victory. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. It was about showing that students like him couldn't be silenced anymore. Policy changes, a school forced to change. But the consequences for Mr. Collins were only the beginning. The district's investigation didn't just focus on individual teachers, it also turned a spotlight on the school's administration and its role in allowing a discriminatory culture to persist. Principal Harrison, who had dismissed Marcus's initial concerns and suggested he was misinterpreting the situation, was also called to account for his actions, or lack thereof. The investigation revealed that the administration had a history of downplaying or ignoring complaints from students, especially those involving racial bias. Incidents that should have been taken seriously were often brushed aside, and no meaningful changes had ever been implemented to address the concerns that had been raised over the years. Faced with mounting pressure from both the district and the community, the school administration was forced to reckon with its complicity in allowing this culture to thrive. Principal Harrison issued a formal apology to the students, acknowledging the failures of the administration to adequately address their concerns. It was a public statement, broadcast at a school assembly, but Marcus could tell it wasn't just lip service. The pressure from the district had made it clear that real change was expected. In the weeks that followed, the school began implementing new policies aimed at promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Teachers were required to undergo training on implicit bias and cultural competency, and the school created a new system for students to report incidents of discrimination without fear of retaliation. A diversity committee, made up of students, teachers, and community members, was formed to ensure that these issues would be addressed moving forward. For Marcus, seeing these changes take shape felt like the culmination of everything they have fought for. The protest had started as a way to speak out against one teacher's actions, but it had grown into something much bigger, a movement that had forced the school to confront its own failures and commit to creating a more inclusive environment for all students. A new beginning. As the dust settled, Marcus reflected on everything that had happened. It had been a long, difficult journey, filled with doubt, frustration, and moments when he wasn't sure if anything would change. But now, looking back, he could see the impact they had made. The protest had sparked something in the school, a movement for change that couldn't be ignored. And while there was still work to be done, Marcus knew they had taken the first crucial step. They had forced the school to listen, to acknowledge the harm that had been done, and to commit to doing better. It wasn't just about one teacher, one protest, or one student. It was about all of them. It was about creating a school where every student's voice mattered, where every student was treated with respect and dignity, and where the culture of silence and dismissal was no longer tolerated. As Marcus walked through the halls, now filled with more hope than tension, he knew the fight wasn't over. But he also knew that they had started something that would last. And that was worth everything. A new beginning. Marcus sat on the steps outside the school, the autumn sun warming his face as he watched students pass by. The energy in the air was different now. It wasn't heavy with tension or whispers of dissent. It was lighter, more hopeful. The protest was months behind him, but the effects of what had happened lingered, reverberating through the halls and classrooms of the school. He hadn't expected things to change so quickly, but the ripple effect of his actions had been undeniable. The investigation, the district stepping in, the consequences for Mr. Collins, and the new policies the administration had been forced to adopt, it was all a testament to the power of speaking up. And though the journey had been long and difficult, Marcus could now see the impact of his decision to fight back. It wasn't just about him anymore. The protest had sparked something much larger than his individual struggle. Students were no longer afraid to speak out when they saw or experienced injustice. Teachers who had once stayed silent were now vocal advocates for equity and inclusion. There was still work to be done, there always would be, but the culture of the school had begun to shift. As Marcus sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he felt a deep sense of pride. He wasn't the same person who had stood in front of Mr. Collins' class that day, humiliated and unsure of himself. He had grown stronger, more confident, and more determined. The doubts that had once plagued him, about his worth, his ideas, his voice, had faded. In their place was a quiet, unshakable conviction. He thought about the students who had come to him after the protest, students he didn't even know, thanking him for standing up and giving them the courage to do the same. Some had shared their own stories of being dismissed or disrespected, stories that echoed Marcus's own experience. Others had simply expressed gratitude for being part of something bigger, for feeling like their voices finally mattered. That was what mattered most to Marcus now. It wasn't about proving Mr. Collins wrong or seeking revenge for what had happened. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he had gone through, about creating a space where every student felt seen, heard, and respected. He had grown into a leader, not because he had sought out the role, but because he had been thrust into it. And now, he knew that leadership wasn't about being the loudest or the most powerful. It was about using your voice to lift up others, to create change where it was needed, and to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. A legacy of change. The changes in the school were already beginning to take root. The diversity committee, which included students, teachers, and community members, had become a driving force for change, ensuring that issues of bias and discrimination were addressed head-on. The new reporting system gave students a safe way to speak out without fear of retaliation, and teachers were undergoing regular training to better understand the impact of their words and actions. Marcus wasn't the only one who had grown from the experience. Layla had emerged as a fierce advocate for student rights, continuing to organize events and lead discussions about equity and justice. Jamie had become even more outspoken, challenging anyone who tried to downplay the importance of the protest. And Miss Johnson, always the quiet mentor, had taken on a more prominent role in pushing for systemic change within the school's administration. The impact of the protest had even reached beyond the walls of the school. The media coverage had drawn attention to the broader issue of racial bias in education, sparking conversations in other schools and districts. Marcus had received messages from students in neighboring towns, thanking him for his bravery and sharing their own stories of discrimination. It was humbling, and at times overwhelming, to realize just how far the ripple effect of his actions had spread. But the most significant change was the way students and teachers interacted with one another. There was a newfound sense of respect in the air, an understanding that every student's voice was valuable. Teachers were more mindful of their words, more intentional about creating an inclusive environment, and students, especially those who had once felt invisible, were beginning to feel like they belonged. Closing with hope. As Marcus sat there, watching the school's doors open and close as students filed in and out, he couldn't help but smile. He knew there were still challenges ahead, that the fight for equity and justice was far from over. But he also knew that they had taken a crucial first step. They had created a spark, and that spark was already lighting the way for others. It was funny, in a way, how something that had started with a moment of humiliation, with a single teacher's dismissive words, had grown into a movement for change. Mr. Collins had tried to silence Marcus, to make him feel small, but in the end, his actions had only made Marcus's voice louder, stronger, and more determined. The people who had doubted him, who had said the protest wouldn't make a difference, who had whispered that it was a waste of time, were now silent. The students who had joined him, the teachers who had supported him, and the community that had rallied behind him, they had proved that one person's courage could inspire others to act, that one voice could spark a movement. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the next class, Marcus stood up, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back. He took one last look at the school before heading inside, a sense of calm and purpose filling him. He knew that his journey wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. He was no longer the boy who had been humiliated in front of his classmates. He was a leader, an advocate, and most importantly, a voice for those who couldn't speak up. And in the end, that was all he had ever wanted, to be heard. With a hopeful heart and a clear mind, Marcus walked back into the school, ready to continue the work he had started. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: change was coming, and there was no turning back now. And as he stepped into the hallway, surrounded by the familiar faces of his peers, Marcus knew that, in the end, he had left everyone, especially his doubters, speechless. The story had only just begun.